Okay, I'm going to try to do a video here to show the angles and measurements that you're looking for. This is the very bottom of the chassis on the main chassis tubes. I'll show you here. That's the two main chassis tubes, like right under the cockpit area. So with the chassis leveled and those set to 0 degrees, that's where I started out. So with those, the main chassis set to 0, now I've moved forward onto the two main tubes that are underneath, like the hood, front hood area, like where the X is that goes underneath where the battery is mounted. As you can see, those two tubes are angled upward at 4 degrees. Just to zoom out here and show you, those are the tubes that the control arms, the lower control arms, are mounted to. That's these two tubes here, this one and this one over here, that run right underneath this X where the battery is normally mounted in the car. So those are angled upwards at 4 degrees. This is the tube that runs, this is where the angle meter is. So this tube runs all the way from underneath the dash all the way forward to right here in between the shock mounts. So let's go back. So that is level with the bottom of the chassis. That tube is. Okay. This is the tube that runs, okay, right here where my cursor is. That's the center of the shock mount, as we were looking at from the other side. That's where this tube ends, this tube that runs under the dash. So that tube ends here and then extends forward down here to support the radiator. So that is at about 13.5 degrees or so of angle. Okay, this is underneath the radiator. And as you can see, it's about 24 degrees off from level, and that is this area here, kind of parallel with the radiator and the AC condenser. That angles forward from this very forward tube, the very front tube on the chassis, and angles down to support the radiator and the AC condenser. The hood hinges are mounted right to the other side of this area here. This is the hood hinge in the background. Okay, there's another view of that area. Okay, this is just giving you a view of that same tube that I just had the angle meter on. It runs back and attaches to another tube back here. Okay, that runs all the way across the chassis. Same thing comes out the other side here on the other side of the radiator. Okay, and then this is the other tube that runs up to the very front. This is that same tube right here that runs across. Okay, here is the bottom of the chassis again, just kind of giving you a view of some different angles so you can kind of see where the suspension mounts are and how these, kind of the spacing here of where this, where my pointer is right here, cursor is, there's a space there, and then that square tube that I just showed you that runs behind the radiator, that runs right across here, okay, and is welded to these tabs here, and then it runs all the way across, welds right here to this tab, and runs all the way across behind the radiator. Okay, here is kind of a view looking, this would be the front leg of the lower control arm on the driver's side looking up, so you can kind of see how these diagonal tubes tie the chassis together. So there's a diagonal tube that runs from the top of, this is that main chassis tube that's angled at 4 degrees. Okay, then there's another tube that runs up and ties the chassis together here. Again, this is the little square tube that runs in behind the radiator here. Okay, here's your steering rack. Okay, another view of that very same area, just from a different angle. So this is that main chassis tube that's angled at 4 degrees. This is just a diagonal tube that supports and triangulates the chassis. This is the very front leg of the lower control arm. This is the back side of that same tube. So we were looking at the other side of the tube in the frame before. This is the back side of that tube, extending up and tying into the chassis tube above it. Okay, and here is the passenger side, basically the same kind of situation on the passenger side, just giving you some different views from some different angles. Here is your measurement. Let me skip forward here. Here's your measurement, and I have a screenshot of this also coming up later here. But the end of this tube is the center of the weld. This is your shock mount on the passenger side. So this is your upper shock mount right here. And the center of the weld is at about 25 3/16. Okay? And that tube runs all the way into the main tube underneath the dash. Okay, so this tube right here is the 1.5-inch square tube that runs all the way across underneath the dash that the steering column is mounted to. So this is measuring forward from the front face of that tube forward to the center line of the weld above the shock mount, which, like I said, the center line of the weld is about 25 3/16, about right there. Okay. Again, this is just showing you some of the triangulation of the other tubes. I'm not going to give you measurements for those, because those are, I mean, you can just kind of tell by the pictures where they go to and from, where they start, where they end. This diagonal tube runs all the way into the center. I'll show you in some other photos here. Right, so that's just from a little bit different angle, so you can see where the front of this short little tube goes. So it just runs down and attaches to this other tube here. Okay, and then how these diagonal tubes start right there in behind that weld at the 25, the center of the weld is right here where my cursor is. Right, so the center of that weld, that tube just runs down and ties into this frame tube that runs right across the bottom of, underneath the master cylinders and stuff. Runs underneath it there and ties everything together. Same with these diagonal tubes here. They just pretty much run to the kind of the same area and tie everything together. Just another view of the same area. These two diagonal tubes pretty much meet in the middle right here. And here's just a view of it from down a little bit further. These are those two tubes that I just showed you, and then these are the two other tubes that diagonal out. So you can see there's just a little bit of space right here. There's just a little bit of space in between those two, just so they had real estate to weld everything together. Measurement from that same line, that 25 3/16 line in the middle of the shock mount area there. So we go from there forward to basically the end of that tube. They've kind of got it notched out, and the end of that tube ends right there. So the end of that tube ends at pretty much right on 28 inches. And like I said, they kind of have it notched. They kind of have it notched back to fit the tube that runs along the front of the radiator, and that's what this is. This magnet is stuck right to the front face of this tube in front of the radiator, so you can see it's at about 67 degrees there. And I'll zoom out here. So this is just stuck to this tube that runs all the way across in front of the radiator here. So that tube is at that angle so that the radiator can mount to it. Okay, and this is the overall width of basically all these tubes. Everything that I've shown you so far, the overall width on all this stuff, up at the radiator, clear back at the dash, everything is 33 inches wide. So all this stuff is 33 inches wide. Where the suspension points are welded, all the way up to where the radiator's at, all the way back to where it ties into that main chassis tube underneath the dash that the steering column mounts to. All that stuff has a width of 33 inches. Right? So that's the main width all the way across, 33 inches. This tube is the one that runs down, that's parallel, pretty much parallel to the radiator and the condenser, AC condenser. So that's where I started my measurement, at the front face of that tube where the tape measure is, and ran it all the way up to the top. So from there pretty much to the front of that tube that runs in front of the radiator, to the front edge of that is like 20 5/16, 23/8, somewhere in there. Okay, there's kind of a view down in on the, on the back side of the radiator, I guess, to show you how that kind of is set up. Back side of the radiator. Same thing, back side of the radiator. This is that diagonal tube that runs down. I had the tape measure butted right up against this face right here and extending out to get that 20 3/8 or whatever. This runs across the width of the chassis. That's the other side. That's the passenger side view. This is the dimension up from that same area that I was just on. So this is the tube that runs down parallel with the radiator. Now this is just measuring straight up to the next tube above it. Which you can see to the bottom side of that is about 7.5 inches. From there to the bottom side of this tube is 7.5 inches. Okay. Again, this is just kind of showing you some more of the way everything is triangulated. Tube that runs diagonal up here. The other tubes that run diagonal back here to the center part of the kind of dash area or cowl area. Again, same thing. This is right behind the radiator, so there's a tube that runs all the way across up here. This is the dimension from, this is the tunnel area underneath the cockpit. So these are the coolant tubes, the main coolant tubes. Here's the main chassis that's completely level. These are the tubes that are angled up at 4 degrees. So I butted the tape measure up right against the front face of this tube here and ran it out to the end, and as you can see, those tubes right to the end there are about 32 3/4 total length from the front face of that tube to the front face of the tubes right behind the radiator there. Right, same, just showing you where the tape measure was at. Okay, and here is the width across from the inside of that tube from the inside of that tube to the inside of on the opposite side, and as you can see, that's about 18.5 from inside to inside. Yep, 18.5 inside to inside. Okay, and again from that same tube right under the cooling tubes. Right here are the tubes that angle up at 4 degrees. Okay, so from there forward to this X that's underneath the battery. The back side of the X is about right at 18 inches forward from that tube. Right, there's a different view of the same thing. Kind of blurs out. Not a very good picture on that one. Okay, here is the steering rack. This is the right hand side of the steering rack. So you can see the bolt center line of the bolt hole here for the steering rack on the right hand side. And I moved the camera so it was pretty well parallel with the side of this tube. So you've got, I believe that is like 1 15/16 inches. Right, this would be 1 3/4, 1 7/8, so 1 15/16 from the face, from this face of this main chassis tube inboard to the center line of where sorry if I didn't catch that, the face of this tube to, for some reason that's kind of getting a glare, but to the center line of the steering rack bolt is about 1 15/16 inches. This is the view of the other steering rack bracket. Okay, so this is the driver's side of the steering rack. Okay, this is again your main chassis tubes. Here's the steering rack. Okay, so that you're just catching kind of the edge of the bolt hole here. Same thing, I line the camera up. I line the camera up with the edge of the inboard edge of this main chassis tube, and it just pretty much catches the edge of the bolt hole right here. Okay, and I'd say that picture was taken by mistake. Okay, and this is from the top of the chassis tube up to about the center of the bolt. Okay, which I would say is about 1 1/4, 1 5/16 or so up from from here up to the center line of the steering rack mount. This is basically, okay, this is your aluminum. This is that tube that runs right behind the bottom of the radiator. Okay, it runs across here. Oops, it runs across here, that tube that runs behind the radiator. Okay, here's your lower control, front edge of your lower control arm. So there's about a 7/8 gap in between the front face of those main chassis tubes and the back part of this aluminum panel, which the aluminum panel drops straight down from this chassis tube that runs behind the radiator. So there's about a 7/8 gap there. And this right here, that's the weld that welds that chassis tube to these brackets that are welded to the chassis. So there's about a 7/8 gap there. Okay, and this is just giving you an idea of the dimensions for the hood mount brackets. If you have to recreate those hood mount brackets, so from the inside of that bracket forward, you're looking at about 7 3/8, and that's from the forward side of that to the forward side of that is about 7 3/8. Okay, or 7 5/16. And those brackets are 2 inches wide that the hood hinges mount to. Okay, those are just the hood hinge brackets. Okay, and that is the picture that I took, that I photoshopped or whatever and made the mark. That's the tube that goes from the front face of the tube underneath the dash all the way forward to the center line of the weld above the shock mount there. And that is all the pictures I've got here.